The Nassau class was a group of 4 dreadnought battleships built for the German Kaiserliche Marine or Imperial Navy in the mid-1900s. The class comprised Nassau, the lead ship, Rhineland, Posen, and Westphalen. All 4 ships were laid down in mid-1907, and completed by late 1910, though commonly perceived as having been built in response to the British dreadnought. Their design traces its origin to 1903. They were in fact a response to dreadnoughts predecessors of the Lord Nelson class. The Nassaus adopted a main battery of 12 11-inch guns and 6 twin-gun turrets in an unusual hexagonal arrangement. Unlike many other dreadnoughts, the Nassau-class ships retained triple-expansion steam engines instead of more powerful steam turbines. After entering service in early 1910, Nassau and Westphalen joined 1st Battle Squadron, with the latter serving as the flagship. Later that year, they were joined by Posen and Rhineland as they were commissioned for service. Over the next 4 years, the ships took part in a routine of squadron and fleet maneuvers, gunnery practice, and training cruises. Each year typically culminated in a summer training cruise in July, frequently to Norwegian waters, followed by the annual fleet maneuvers held in late August and early September. The one exception to this was 1912, when the summer training cruise remained in the Baltic Sea owing to increased tensions with Britain and France as a result of the Agadir crisis. The ships were in Norway during the July crisis in 1914 and were hastily recalled to begin the mobilization for war when it became apparent that conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia would not be avoided. After the start of the war, the German fleet embarked on a campaign of raids of the British coast intended to draw out portions of the British Grand Fleet or force the British to disperse their forces to stop the raids. The High Seas Fleet would then be able to concentrate its own ships to destroy isolated elements, thereby reducing the numerical superiority of the British fleet. The first of these was the raid on Yarmouth on November 2 to 3, 1914, which was conducted by the battlecruisers of Contra-Admiral Franz von Hipper's first scouting group. While the battleships provided distant support, the operation failed to locate any significant British forces. It was followed by the raid on Scarborough, Hartlepool, and Whitby on December 15 to 16. During the night, the fleet destroyer screen encountered British warships, a squadron of 6 battleships and their escorts, but the German commander, Vice Admiral Friedrich von Ingenel, believed he was confronting the entire Grand Fleet and disengaged. The Nassaus and the rest of the fleet got underway to relieve the battlecruisers after they were ambushed in the Battle of Dogger Bank on January 24, 1915, but they arrived too late to intervene. The fleet conducted several sweeps into the North Sea to try to locate British patrols in March, April, and May but did not encounter any. The Germans planned to clear the Gulf of Riga to facilitate the capture of the city by the Imperial German Army. The Russian Baltic Fleet had stationed the pre-dreadnought Slava and a number of gunboats and destroyers in the Gulf, the entrances to which were protected by a series of minefields. The first attempt during the Battle of the Gulf of Riga to breach the minefields and enter the Gulf on August 8 was as it had taken too long to clear the Russian minefields to allow the Minelayer Deutschland to lay a minefield of her own. They made another attempt beginning on August 16, led by Nassau and Posen, along with 4 light cruisers and 31 torpedo boats. A minesweeper and destroyer were sunk that day, and the next day Nassau and Posen engaged in an artillery duel with Slava, forcing her to withdraw after scoring 3 hits. The remaining minesweepers cleared a path into the Gulf, but reports of Allied submarines prompted a German withdrawal. The ships then returned to the High Seas Fleet in the North Sea. After returning to the North Sea, the fleet conducted another sortie in the hope of catching a British squadron in October, with further operations beginning in March, 1916. Now under the direction of Reinhard Scheer, these operations included the attack on Yarmouth and Lowestoft in April. Unknown to the Germans, the British were aware of their intentions before embarking on these raids. The German light cruiser Magdeburg had run aground in the Baltic in August, 1914, and Russian forces had salvaged German codebooks from the wreck and passed a copy to their British allies. With the ability to decode German wireless signals, they could send forces to attack the High Seas Fleet under conditions favorable to themselves, as they had done at Dogger Bank. This led to the Battle of Jutland on May 31. When the British sought to catch the German fleet far enough away from port that it could be cut off and destroyed, the German fleet sortied in the early hours of May 31st, intending to make a demonstration with Hipper's battlecruisers to draw out as British counterparts of the battlecruiser fleet. The British, aware of Skeier's plans, were already at sea, having left their base at Scapa Flow late on May 30th. The four Nassaus and the rest of 1st Battle Squadron formed the center of the German line of battle, astern of Poelbang's II Battle Squadron and ahead of the old pre-dreadnoughts of Franz Mov's II Battle Squadron. Posen served as the flagship of 2nd Division under Walter Engelhard. The initial phase of the action, which began at 1600 hours on May 31st, consisted of a running battle between the opposing battlecruiser squadrons as Hipper lured the British commander, Vice Admiral David Beatty, south towards Skeier's fleet. Upon spotting the German fleet, Beatty turned north, leading the Germans toward the approaching Grand Fleet under Admiral John Jellicoe. As the fleets converged close to 1800 hours, the German battleships, including the Nassaus, engaged British light cruisers and destroyers, with Posen contributing to the destruction of the destroyer Nestor. By 1830, the Grand Fleet had arrived on the scene, and was deployed into a position that would cross Skeier's T from the northeast. To extricate his fleet from this precarious position, Scheer ordered a 16-point turn to the southwest. At 1855, Scheer decided to conduct another 16-point turn to launch an attack on the British fleet but was quickly forced to break off and withdraw. The Germans then maneuvered to disengage from the Grand Fleet and return to port. As darkness fell, the High Seas Fleet attempted to pass astern of the Grand Fleet as the latter steamed south, before turning south themselves to reach Wilhelmshaven. At around 21:20, lookouts aboard Posen spotted a group of British battlecruisers and she opened fire, scoring a hit on Princess Royal and straddling Indomitable, though her sisters could not make out targets and held their fire. Shortly thereafter, Nassau and Westphalen engaged British light cruisers and forced them to withdraw. At around midnight on June 1st, Nassau came in contact with the British destroyer Spitfire, and in the confusion, attempted to ram her. Spitfire tried to evade, but could not maneuver away fast enough, and the two ships collided. Nassau fired her forward 11-inch guns at the destroyer, but they could not depress low enough for Nassau to be able to score a hit. Nonetheless, the blast from the guns destroyed Spitfire's bridge. At that point, Spitfire was able to disengage from Nassau, and took with her a 20-foot portion of Nassau's side plating. The collision disabled one of her 5.9-inch guns, and left an 11.5-foot gash above the waterline. This slowed the ship to 15 knots until it could be repaired. At approximately the same time, Posen accidentally rammed the light cruiser Elbing and hauled her below the waterline. Elbing was damaged so severely that her engine room was completely flooded and she was unable to move. The captain of the ship ordered Elbing be scuttled to prevent her capture by the British. Shortly after 1 o'clock, Nassau and Torringen encountered the British armored cruiser Black Prince. Torringen opened fire first, and pummeled Black Prince with a total of 27 large-caliber shells and 24 shells from her secondary battery. Nassau and Ostfriesland joined in, followed by Friedrich der Grosse. The combined weight of fire destroyed Black Prince in a tremendous explosion. The wreck of the ship was directly in the path of Nassau. To avoid it, the ship had to steer sharply towards 3rd Battle Squadron. It was necessary for the ship to steam at full speed astern in order to avoid a collision with Kaiserin. Nassau then fell back into a position between the pre-dreadnoughts Hessen and Hanover. Following the return to German waters, Nassau, Posen, and Westphalen, along with the Helgoland-class battleships Helgoland and Torringen, took up defensive positions in the Jade roadstead for the night, while Rhineland refueled and rearmed. The Nassau-class ships suffered only a handful of secondary battery hits from the opposing Grand Fleet. Nassau was hit twice, Westphalen and Rhineland each once, and Posen escaped completely unscathed. Not a single ship of the four was struck by a heavy caliber shell. Less than 3 months after Jutland, Scheer embarked on another operation in the North Sea. In the resulting action of August 16, 1916, Westphalen was torpedoed by the British submarine HMS 23, but suffered minimal damage and was soon repaired. Further operations took place in September and October, though the fleet saw little activity in 1917, while the bulk of the fleet conducted Operation Albion in the Gulf of Riga in October. 1917, the four Nassaus patrolled the eastern Baltic to block a potential British incursion to support Russia. In February 1918, Westphalen and Rhineland were detached from the High Seas Fleet and ordered into the Baltic Sea. Finland was revolting against Russian rule, and the two ships were to aid the Finns in the Civil War. Posen joined them there in early April. On April 11, Rhineland ran aground off Åland. Approximately 6,000 tons of guns, belt armor, and coal were removed in order to lighten her enough to be refloated, which was not accomplished until July 9. Rhineland was never repaired, and instead saw the remainder of her service as a barracks ship in Kiel. In late 1917, German light forces had begun raiding British convoys to Norway, prompting the British to send heavy escorts. This provided the German fleet with the opportunity for which it had been waiting the entire war, a chance to destroy an isolated portion of the Grand Fleet. The Germans had mistaken intelligence about the timing of the convoys, however, and failed to intercept one when they sortied in April 1918. Nassau was the only member of the class to take part in the operation. While returning from Finland in August, Westphalen was removed from active service for use as a gunnery training ship. The fleet saw little activity in the final months of the war and morale plummeted, leading to the Wilhelmshaven mutiny when it became clear that Scheer and Hitler intended to mount a last-ditch attack on the Grand Fleet in the last days of the war. Following the end of the First World War in 1918, 11 battleships of the König, Kaiser, and Byron classes and all 5 battle cruisers, along with a number of light cruisers and destroyers, were interned in Scapa-Flow. While their fate was determined in the negotiations over the Treaty of Versailles, the Nassau and Helgoland-class battleships were left in Germany. Following the scuttling of the German fleet in June 1919, all 4 ships were allotted to the victorious Allied powers as replacements for the scuttled ships. Nassau was ceded to Japan, Britain received Westphalen and Posen, and Rhineland was sold directly to the breakers at Dordrecht. Between 1920 and 1924, Westphalen was scrapped at Birkenhead and the remaining ships were scrapped at Dordrecht.